He publicly humiliated his paralyzed wife for his pregnant mistress, but didn't know she had a secret that would destroy everything he'd built. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're from. Don't forget to share this video with your friends. Naomi Sanders had always been the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it hers without ever raising her voice. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had built her empire not on privilege or luck, but on the relentless pursuit of excellence. Her presence was magnetic, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. People noticed when Naomi arrived. They whispered about her talent, her style, her resilience. But more than that, they respected her. She had carved her place in a world that hadn't been designed for her. A world that rarely left space for a black woman to lead without apology. On the evening of September 9th, Naomi was preparing for the culmination of everything she had worked toward for nearly 2 decades. The Center for Inclusive Design, her brainchild and passion project, was just 1 day away from its grand opening. A sleek, innovative space built not merely for aesthetics, but for function and fairness. Naomi's entire career had been a declaration that good design was about people, about dignity, about possibility, and tomorrow she would unveil that vision to the world. Her staff bustled around her like a well-oiled machine. The courtyard of the new building shimmered under soft floodlights as florists arranged bouquets, technicians adjusted sound equipment, and young interns rushed to and fro with clipboards and schedules. Naomi observed everything from her usual stance at the heart of the storm, her dark eyes sharp, missing nothing. Her short, natural curls framed her face as she moved through the space in a tailored navy suit, crisp and immaculate, her phone in one hand, a radio in the other. Somewhere across the square, she spotted her husband, Edward Sanders, deep in conversation with one of the city's planning commissioners. Edward stood out in every crowd, tall and composed in his expensive charcoal suit, his light skin and classic features giving him an air of untouchable authority. He was the kind of man who moved effortlessly through rooms of power, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, playing the game. When he caught her eye across the courtyard, he smiled and raised his hand in a small wave. Naomi nodded back, though the gesture felt mechanical. Lately, there had been something hollow behind Edward's smile, something practiced rather than genuine. But tonight, Naomi refused to dwell on that. There would be time for reflection later. Tonight was about the center and the future it represented. As the evening wore on, Naomi's feet ached, but she remained until the last detail was confirmed, until every light was positioned perfectly and every name tag printed. Her assistant, Tamara, reminded her gently, more than once, that she should rest, but Naomi brushed her off. She had never been the kind of woman to leave work unfinished. It wasn't until nearly midnight that she finally allowed herself to sit in her office on the 2nd floor of the new building. The office was a testament to her style. Minimal, functional, elegant. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, and in the distance, she could see the cranes and scaffolding of the future developments she had helped bring to life. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Edward. Leaving now. Don't stay too late. She stared at the screen a moment longer than necessary before locking it. She had grown used to his absence, the subtle distance that had crept into their marriage like ivy over the years. Still, she appreciated that he had shown up tonight, at least for appearance's sake. The next morning was gray and wet. The forecast had predicted a light drizzle, but the sky looked heavier than that as Naomi's car pulled up in front of the center. She stepped out with an umbrella in hand, her assistant Tamara at her side, and surveyed the building with quiet pride. It had taken years to get here, years of contracts, permits, compromises, and late nights, but it had all been worth it. The rain had not yet started falling when Naomi decided to take one last walk through the building. There was something about empty spaces before an event, the calm before the noise, that she loved. She moved from room to room, inspecting every corner, her mind ticking off final details. When she reached the rear atrium, she noticed two construction workers speaking quietly by the temporary platform that had been erected during the final week of preparations. The platform overlooked the central hall, a space where Naomi planned to deliver her opening speech that evening. According to protocol, it had been signed off as safe 2 days ago, but Naomi had learned long ago never to trust paperwork alone. She approached the workers, exchanged brief pleasantries, and asked one of them to escort her up to the platform so she could check the view for herself. They seemed hesitant, but neither refused her. After all, she was the boss. The rain began to fall as Naomi climbed the narrow metal stairs to the platform. Each step echoed under her heels. She reached the top, standing still for a moment, breathing in the quiet. From here, she could see the full expanse of the center's interior, the glass walls, the accessible walkways, the soaring atrium that seemed to invite light itself. And then, in an instant, the world shifted. There was no sound at first, only the sensation of movement beneath her feet, the metal shuddering, giving way. Naomi barely had time to register the look of horror on the worker's face below before the platform collapsed beneath her. The ground rushed up to meet her, and everything went black. When Naomi opened her eyes again, it was to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room and the rhythmic beeping of machines. For several seconds, she felt nothing at all. No pain, no confusion, only an unsettling emptiness. Then, like a wave, reality washed over her. Her body felt foreign, heavy, wrong. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried to move and couldn't. Voices filtered in through the haze, her assistant, her doctors, and eventually Edward, his voice soft and soothing, calling her name. She remembered fragments, the fall, the darkness, the shattering pain, and Edward's face hovering over her, wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. In the days that followed, the details became clearer. A severe spinal injury, surgery, uncertainty, long recovery, words she had never thought would apply to her. Incomplete paraplegia, limited mobility, wheelchair dependent. Edward was always there in those first weeks, never missing a visiting hour, holding her hand, smiling sadly. He reassured her constantly. They would get through this together. He had already started making the house accessible. He would hire the best therapists, the best doctors. They would adjust. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something Naomi couldn't name, a shadow lurking behind every comforting phrase. Weeks passed, the pain receded, but the heaviness in her chest did not. She watched her body change, watched her muscles weaken, watched the world she had built begin to move without her. When she was finally discharged from the hospital, she returned not to her old life, but to a new version of it, a version that felt smaller, narrower, like a house with walls slowly closing in. Her studio, once bustling and vibrant, now ran without her. Edward assured her it was for the best. She needed to focus on recovery. He had hired new staff to ease her burden. He had made all the hard decisions so she wouldn't have to. At first, she was grateful. The simplest tasks required so much effort: getting dressed, transferring from her chair to the bed, managing medications. It was easier to let Edward take care of everything, easier to believe that he was doing it out of love. But as the weeks turned to months, Naomi began to feel the shape of her new reality settling around her like a cage. Decisions were made without her. Friends drifted away. Her name appeared less and less in articles about her studio's projects. Every time she asked about returning to work, Edward reminded her gently but firmly that she needed rest, that she wasn't ready, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the life she had built slipped from her grasp. Yet even then, in the quiet hours of the night, lying awake in their newly renovated, accessible home, Naomi would stare at the ceiling and feel something burning in her chest. A spark she didn't yet recognize, a voice soft but insistent, whispering that this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, each one indistinguishable from the last. Naomi Sanders' world had shrunk to the size of her home and the limited routine imposed on her in the name of recovery. What had once been a vibrant, full life, a whirlwind of projects, meetings, travel, and laughter, had narrowed to therapy sessions, medical appointments, and the sterile comfort of a house that now felt more like an institution than a home. At first, Naomi told herself that this was temporary, that once her body healed enough, she would reclaim the rhythm of her life, the pulse of her career, the independence she had fought for since she was a girl growing up in a world that never gave her the benefit of the doubt. But recovery proved slower than she had imagined. Each step forward was met with a new obstacle, a new frustration. Her home, once a testament to her taste and success, had been retrofitted in her absence. Ramps now sloped over the steps of the grand entrance. Handrails lined the hallways. The furniture had been rearranged for ease of access, and the master bedroom transformed, her side now equipped with a hospital-grade adjustable bed, medical equipment discreetly tucked into the corners. It was Edward who had overseen it all. She remembered the first time he showed her the renovations, guiding her wheelchair gently through the doorway, his hand light but possessive on her shoulder. "I wanted to make things easier for you," he had said, his smile patient and kind. "This way, you won't have to struggle." At the time, she had felt overwhelmed with gratitude. The fall had left her fractured, not only in body but in spirit. She had clung to Edward's calm efficiency, to the way he seemed to carry both of them when she could barely carry herself. She didn't question the decisions he made, the papers he asked her to sign, the doctors he consulted on her behalf. It wasn't until much later that she would realize how subtle the shift had been, how carefully the walls had been built around her. Her days followed an unchanging rhythm. A nurse arrived each morning to assist with her medications, followed by a physical therapist who guided her through a routine of exercises. Edward checked in briefly before leaving for work, always with a soft kiss on her forehead and a reminder to take it easy. By noon, the house fell into a hollow silence. Naomi spent hours in the sunroom or her home office, staring at the emails and project updates she was no longer expected to respond to. Her name remained on the letterhead of her design studio, but decisions were made without her input. Clients she had once courted personally now communicated through Edward, or more often, through Kira Davis, the young project manager Edward had hired shortly after Naomi's accident. Kira was everything Naomi was not. Light-skinned, effortlessly social, unburdened by years of fighting for space in boardrooms and design competitions. She was smart, certainly, but she lacked the depth, the fire, the hard-earned wisdom that had shaped Naomi's career. Still, Edward praised her constantly. "She's talented," he said over dinner one evening. "You should meet with her sometime, mentor her." Naomi had smiled, too exhausted to argue. Her friends stopped visiting. At first, they came in a steady stream, bringing flowers, stories, gossip. But over time, their visits grew less frequent. Some cited busy schedules, others discomfort at seeing her so changed. Eventually, it became clear that Edward had become the gatekeeper of her social life. "She's still adjusting," he would tell them. "It's best to give her space." Her family, too, seemed to drift away. Her sister's calls became less frequent. Her mother's concerned voicemails left unanswered. Naomi knew she should reach out, but each day felt heavier than the last, her energy consumed by the simple act of existing. The medications dulled everything, the sharp edges of her grief, the ache in her muscles, the flickering doubts that crept in late at night. Edward managed her prescriptions meticulously, organizing them into neat little trays. He reminded her to take each dose, sometimes even handing her the pills with a glass of water. "You need to stay ahead of the pain," he would say gently. "You don't want to fall behind." She obeyed, grateful at first for the numbness they provided, but as the months passed, she noticed how the fog never quite lifted, how the days blurred together in a haze of fatigue and forgetfulness. It wasn't until she tried to return to work that she understood how much had changed. The studio had been her sanctuary, her creation. She had built it from the ground up, selecting every member of her team, guiding every project. It had been her lifeblood. One morning, 3 months after her discharge, Naomi mentioned casually over breakfast that she was thinking of dropping by the office. Edward looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "I think so," she replied. "It's been too long. I miss it." He hesitated, then smiled in that way he had perfected. Sympathetic, careful. "Maybe wait a little longer. The staff are adjusting to new workflows. It might overwhelm you." Naomi let the conversation drop, unsure why his words felt like a dismissal rather than concern. Weeks turned into months. Every time she suggested attending a meeting or reviewing a project, Edward had a reason why she shouldn't. "Focus on your therapy," he would say. "The team is managing fine." And they were, in a way. Kira had stepped into the leadership role Naomi once held. The company website had been updated, her name still listed as founder, but her photo pushed further down the page. The few times she did speak with the former colleagues, their voices carried a strange edge, pity mixed with distance. It was as though they had already written her into the past, the brilliant architect turned tragic figure. Naomi watched her life unfold without her, and she told herself this was recovery, that it was temporary. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that she had been sidelined, not by circumstance, but by design. The evidence was subtle at first. She noticed how Edward began to speak for her at gatherings, answering questions before she could. How he handled correspondence from the studio without consulting her. How he gently but firmly steered conversations away from her involvement. When she asked about finances, he assured her everything was handled. "You don't need to worry," he said. "Just focus on getting better." And she did, for a while, until the night she found the message. It was late, and Edward had left his phone charging on the kitchen counter. Naomi was wheeling herself back from the den when the screen lit up with a notification. A message from Kira. "I can't wait until we can finally tell everyone the truth." Naomi stared at the words, a cold weight settling in her chest. She told herself it was nothing. A misunderstanding. Kira was young, ambitious. Maybe it was about a project. Maybe... The phone buzzed again. "You promised me after the announcement." Naomi backed away from the counter, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't confront Edward that night. Instead, she lay awake in the darkness, replaying every conversation, every decision, every quiet shift in their dynamic. The next morning, she asked casually about the message. Edward smiled, shaking his head. "Kira's young, dramatic. She's excited about the studio's new direction." He made her feel foolish for asking, his tone patient, almost indulgent. Naomi smiled back, but something inside her shifted, fragile and sharp. Days later, when Edward left for a business trip, she searched his study for the first time. She didn't know what she expected to find. Perhaps nothing. But hidden in a folder beneath a stack of financial statements, she found copies of documents she had never seen before. Bank statements. Transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. Payments marked as consulting fees to names she'd never heard of. She photocopied everything. That night, she stared at the pile of papers on her desk, the weight of them pressing down on her. The life she had built was crumbling, brick by brick, beneath the facade of care and concern. And Naomi knew, with a clarity sharper than anything she had felt in months, that she had to find out how deep the cracks ran. Naomi had never considered herself a suspicious person. She had built her career and her life on trust. Trust in her team, in her instincts, in the structure she created and the people she welcomed into her circle. But trust, she had come to realize, was a fragile thing. It wasn't taken from you all at once. It eroded quietly, piece by piece, until one day you woke to find there was nothing left but the sharp, bitter edges of doubt. In the days following her discovery of the financial documents, that doubt grew louder. She had spent hours poring over the statements, cross-referencing the account numbers, the dates, the recipients. Many of the payments were routed to consulting firms she didn't recognize, but the amounts, steady, consistent, significant, suggested something more than business as usual. The name Kira Davis appeared more than once. Naomi felt the weight of each transaction settle in her chest like stones. The pieces were beginning to align, though she did not yet see the full picture. She only knew, with increasing certainty, that her husband's concern and attentiveness masked something else entirely. She began to watch Edward more closely. It was easier than she expected. He had become careless in his certainty that she was too medicated, too dependent, too diminished to notice the details. She caught the way he glanced at his phone when it buzzed across the table, how his expression softened in the moments before he masked it again. She noted the way he spoke about Kira in passing, always complimentary, always measured. The way he deferred her questions about the studio, shifting the conversation to her health, her therapy, her medications. And then there were the medications themselves. Naomi had always trusted the doctors Edward brought to her. Specialists, neurologists, therapists, all respected, all eager to help. She had accepted the regimen without question, swallowing the pills he handed her each morning and night. She had believed the fatigue, the confusion, the persistent fog that clung to her thoughts were the natural consequences of her injury. But now she wondered. One evening, after Edward left for a dinner meeting, she wheeled herself into the bathroom and examined the bottles lined neatly on the shelf. She read the labels carefully, noting the dosages, the prescribing doctors. Something about the list struck her as odd. Overlapping medications, some known to cause drowsiness, others used to treat conditions she didn't have. She wrote down the names, her hand trembling slightly, and promised herself she would ask someone she trusted. That someone turned out to be Martina. Martina Lewis had been Naomi's physical therapist since her discharge from the hospital. Tough, no nonsense, and deeply empathetic, she had become one of the few people Naomi allowed herself to rely on. Martina didn't coddle her. She pushed her, challenged her, reminded her who she had been before the accident. During their next session, Naomi broached the subject casually, as though she weren't holding a storm behind her ribs. "Martina," she said quietly as they finished their stretches, "would you mind looking at something for me?" Martina raised an eyebrow but nodded. Naomi handed her the list she had written, folded carefully in her palm. The therapist scanned the names, her expression darkening with each line. "How long have you been taking all of these?" she asked finally. "Since I got home," Naomi replied. Martina exhaled slowly, folding the paper. "Some of these combinations shouldn't be prescribed together, and the dosages, they're high, too high." The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Naomi didn't ask what that meant. She already knew. After Martina left that day, Naomi sat in the sunroom, staring out at the garden Edward had commissioned for her during her recovery. A carefully manicured space, symmetrical, contained. A perfect metaphor for the life he had built around her. Her heart pounded as she thought back to the message on Edward's phone, the financial documents, the way he managed her medications. It wasn't one thing. It was all of it. A pattern of control so subtle, so carefully constructed that it had taken her months to see it. And she was done pretending not to. The decision to hire a private investigator felt at once terrifying and liberating. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had tried to ignore. The gnawing fear that her accident, her recovery, her entire existence in the months since had been shaped not by chance, but by intention. She made the call late at night, after Edward had fallen asleep beside her, his breathing steady, his arm thrown casually over her waist as though nothing in the world was amiss. The investigator, Clara Jenkins, came recommended by Martina's cousin, who had handled similar cases Naomi hadn't known existed until now. When they met in a quiet cafe across town, Naomi arrived early, positioning herself at a table in the corner, her wheelchair discreetly angled so she could see the entrance. Clara arrived precisely on time, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a calm, professional demeanor. She listened without interrupting as Naomi laid out her suspicions, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning beneath her words. "I need to know the truth," Naomi said finally. "All of it." Clara nodded. "I can help you, but you have to be prepared for what we might find." Naomi met her gaze without flinching. "I'm already prepared." Over the next few weeks, Clara worked quietly and efficiently, feeding Naomi information piece by piece. The picture that emerged was more damning than Naomi had dared to imagine. Kira Davis had been hired at Edward's recommendation within weeks of Naomi's accident. There were no records of a formal interview process, no references checked. Payments from the studio's accounts had been routed to Kira's personal accounts, far beyond her salary. The financial statements Naomi had found were only part of the puzzle. There were offshore accounts, shell companies, a web of transactions designed to obscure their origin and destination. Clara also uncovered something else, something Naomi hadn't expected. Security footage from the construction site the day of her accident showed Edward arriving early that morning, speaking privately with the site foreman. There were no records of an official inspection scheduled for that time. The foreman had since left the company and moved out of state. Clara's tone was careful when she relayed the information. "It's not proof that he caused the accident," she said, "but it's suspicious." Naomi sat in silence for a long time after the meeting, the weight of what she had learned settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Her entire life, her career, her independence, her marriage had been built on trust, and Edward had dismantled it piece by piece until there was nothing left but the illusion of care. She returned home that evening to find him waiting for her in the kitchen, a glass of wine in his hand, the picture of casual concern. "Where were you?" he asked lightly. "I missed you." Naomi smiled, the expression hollow. "Just clearing my head," she said. She watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes flicked to the clock, the slight tension in his jaw when she didn't offer more. The walls were closing in, but this time Naomi wasn't the one trapped. She was done playing the part he had written for her. The first warning had been sounded, and she intended to follow it all the way to the end. The morning after Clara's last report, Naomi awoke before the sun rose, the house still silent around her. The familiar weight in her chest, the heaviness that had lived there since the accident, felt different now. It was no longer the suffocating fog of helplessness. It had crystallized into something sharper, something dangerous. Clarity had finally broken through the haze of pills and manipulation, and in its wake came anger, cold and purposeful. She moved quietly through the house, her wheelchair gliding across the polished floors as she navigated toward the study. The door creaked slightly when she pushed it open, the sound jarring in the early stillness. This room had once been hers. Before the accident, it had been where she sketched, designed, dreamed. Now it was Edward's domain, the walls lined with books and framed certificates, the desk pristine and impersonal. Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she approached the desk. She told herself it was the medication, always the medication, but she knew better. Fear and fury danced just beneath the surface of her composure. She opened the drawers carefully, methodically, searching not for anything specific but for the threads Edward had left behind, the ones Clara hadn't yet found. Her fingers brushed against something tucked beneath a stack of papers at the back of the bottom drawer, a small velvet pouch. Inside, she found a key. It was unmarked, but her heart knew immediately it was important. The sound of footsteps upstairs snapped her out of her search. Edward was awake. She tucked the key into the pocket of her robe, closed the drawer, and left the room as quietly as she had entered. Breakfast passed without incident. Edward was charming as ever, reading headlines aloud, discussing his schedule for the day. Naomi played her part well, nodding, smiling in the right places, feigning interest. She had become good at pretending. When he kissed her goodbye and left for the office, she waited exactly 15 minutes, the time it usually took for his car to disappear down the driveway, before she called Clara. "There's something else," she told her quietly. "A key." Clara's response was immediate and efficient. They arranged to meet that afternoon, far from the house, in a quiet corner of a park Naomi used to visit before her world had shrunk. When they met, Clara examined the key thoughtfully. "It looks like a safe deposit key," she said. "Not a house key, not an office key. The size and the lack of markings suggest it's for something more discreet." Naomi felt her stomach drop. Another secret. Another door she had never been meant to open. Clara promised to follow the lead, and Naomi returned home with her pulse racing, her mind spinning. Every day, the picture grew darker. Every day, she uncovered another lie, another betrayal. And yet, she knew instinctively that she hadn't reached the bottom yet. That afternoon, she sat in her sunroom, staring out at the carefully pruned hedges and symmetrical flower beds Edward had insisted on planting. Everything about the garden spoke of control, of precision, of order. It mirrored the life he had built around her, the cage he had disguised as care. The walls were beginning to crack, and Naomi intended to bring them down completely. The following week, Clara delivered her findings. The key belonged to a safe deposit box registered under one of Edward's shell companies. The contents had been photographed discreetly. Documents detailing the transfer of studio assets, property deeds, financial statements. Among them, a draft agreement to transfer full ownership of Naomi's company to a newly established trust, with Kira Davis listed as a beneficiary. The date on the draft was 2 weeks after Naomi's accident. Naomi's hands tightened around the edge of the table as she read the documents, her knuckles white. He hadn't even waited. While she had been lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, Edward had been preparing to erase her from everything she had built. The realization hit her like a blow. She spent the next several days reviewing everything Clara had gathered, assembling the pieces of a puzzle she no longer had the luxury to ignore. The financial discrepancies, the suspicious construction records, the manipulated medical care, they all pointed to the same devastating conclusion. Her accident had not been an unfortunate consequence of bad luck or negligence. It had been convenient. Whether Edward had directly caused it or simply capitalized on it, Naomi no longer cared. What mattered was what he had done in the aftermath, the careful, calculated dismantling of her life, her autonomy, her identity. She began to wean herself off the medications. It was not easy. The fog lifted slowly, painfully. She experienced withdrawal symptoms, nausea, headaches, restless nights filled with vivid dreams and fragments of memory she hadn't realized she had lost. But with each day, her mind grew clearer. Her body, though still dependent on the wheelchair, began to feel more like her own. Martina noticed the change almost immediately. "You're sharper," she remarked during one of their sessions, "more focused." Naomi met her gaze, something fierce simmering beneath the surface. "I need to be." They worked harder, longer, pushing her limits in ways Edward had always warned against. The progress was slow but undeniable. Naomi could now transfer from her chair to the bed without assistance. She could stand for short periods, her balance improving steadily. Each small victory fueled her determination. Meanwhile, Clara continued to dig deeper. The construction records from the day of Naomi's accident revealed more than just Edward's unauthorized visit to the site. They showed that the temporary platform that had collapsed had been flagged for reinforcement the week before. The work order had been marked as completed, but the documentation was incomplete, and the foreman's signature had been suspiciously absent. When Clara tracked down the foreman, he was reluctant to talk. It took weeks of quiet persuasion, but eventually he agreed to meet. The man, Marcus Jones, was nervous, fidgeting as he spoke, his eyes darting around the small diner where they met. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said, voice low. "Your husband asked me to sign off on the repairs. Said it was a formality, that everything had already been handled. I didn't question it." "Did you see the platform yourself?" Clara asked. Marcus hesitated. "No, I wasn't on shift that day. He called me in after." "Why?" "To delete footage. He said there was an incident, that he wanted to protect you." Naomi's heart clenched. Clara asked the next question gently. "Did you keep a copy?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Didn't feel right, erasing everything." The footage, grainy but clear, showed Edward on the construction site hours before Naomi's inspection, speaking with Marcus, pointing to the platform. Later, the camera captured him handing an envelope to the foreman. It was not definitive proof of intent, but it was damning nonetheless. Naomi watched the footage alone, her hands trembling. She thought back to the weeks after the accident, the endless reassurances, the careful control of her medication, the way Edward had spoken for her, over her, around her. Everything made sense now. He hadn't just betrayed her, he had dismantled her life, brick by brick, until she no longer recognized herself. She knew then that exposing him wouldn't be enough. She had to take back everything he had stolen. The decision came quietly, almost anticlimactically, as she sat in the darkened study that had once been hers. It was time to plan. She called Clara, Martina, and her attorney, Rafael Dominguez, arranging a meeting. The truth, she knew, would not be enough to bring Edward down. She needed a strategy, and this time, she would be the one holding the pieces. The days that followed were measured in quiet, deliberate actions, each one building upon the last. Like the careful placement of stones in a foundation, Naomi was now determined to rebuild. There were no dramatic declarations, no explosive confrontations. That was not how battles like this were won. Naomi understood better than anyone that structures did not collapse in a single moment. They crumbled gradually from the inside until a single push brought everything down. She gathered her allies with precision. Clara Jenkins remained her eyes and ears beyond the walls of her home, continuing to unravel the intricate web of deceit Edward had spun. Martina became her body's ally, adjusting their physical therapy sessions with renewed intensity, no longer pacing the exercises as if Naomi were fragile, but instead pushing her steadily towards the strength she would need. And then there was Rafael Dominguez, the attorney Clara had recommended, who had listened quietly as Naomi laid bare every piece of evidence, every betrayal, before meeting her gaze with calm, clear resolve. "This is not just financial fraud," he had said after reviewing the files. "This is calculated abuse. You've been systematically isolated, gaslit, manipulated. Legally and morally, this is as serious as it gets." Naomi nodded. She didn't need anyone to tell her how serious it was. She had lived every moment of it. The meetings took place discreetly, always away from the house, under the pretense of therapy appointments, lunch dates, or errands. Naomi mastered the art of deception, cultivating an image of complacency and recovery, careful never to let Edward suspect the growing storm beneath the surface. At home, she continued to play the role he expected. She smiled when he asked about her day. She took the pills he handed her, though now she disposed of them discreetly. She feigned forgetfulness and weakness when he checked in, letting him believe she remained trapped in the narrative he had written for her. It was exhausting, living two lives, the woman she pretended to be and the woman she was slowly becoming again. But Naomi had spent her entire life navigating a world designed to underestimate her. She knew how to survive behind a mask. Martina noticed the change before anyone else. "You're sharper," she said one afternoon as they worked through a particularly grueling session. "Stronger." Naomi glanced at her in the mirror, sweat beading at her temple, her breath steady despite the exertion. "I have to be," she replied simply. By the third week of their intensified regimen, Naomi could transfer herself between wheelchair and bed without assistance. She could stand unaided for longer stretches, her balance returning with every session. It was not the kind of progress Edward would want to see. It was dangerous progress, proof that her dependency had never been inevitable, but carefully cultivated. Meanwhile, Raphael and Clara worked behind the scenes, assembling the case piece by piece. The financial records alone painted a damning portrait. Millions siphoned from the studio's accounts into offshore holdings, properties purchased in shell company names. Payments funneled discreetly to Kira Davis. But it was the medical manipulation that chilled Raphael the most. "You were medicated to remain docile," he said during one of their strategy meetings. "To keep you confused, compliant. That alone is criminal." Clara had uncovered communications between Edward and several of Naomi's physicians, emails, messages, notes, detailing specific instructions about her treatment. Subtle suggestions to increase dosages, to emphasize the limitations of her prognosis, to downplay her potential for recovery. It was all there in writing. Naomi absorbed the information without flinching. Every revelation only confirmed what she already knew. Edward had not only betrayed her trust and stolen her career, but had deliberately kept her imprisoned within her own body. And yet, even with the mountain of evidence, Raphael urged caution. "He's been preparing for this," he warned. "We have reason to believe he's already consulted with lawyers about a conservatorship. If you move too soon, he'll weaponize your health against you." Naomi nodded, her jaw tight. She understood. This had to be meticulous, controlled. They spent hours mapping out the strategy, how to present the evidence, when to approach law enforcement, how to manage the public narrative. Clara suggested bringing in a journalist, someone who could amplify Naomi's story, ensure it couldn't be buried or spun by Edward's considerable resources. Naomi agreed, but insisted it wait until everything was ready. There was one more piece of the puzzle she needed. The opportunity presented itself in the form of an invitation. Edward announced it casually over dinner one evening, as though it were just another business event. The annual studio gala, traditionally held in a rented hall downtown, would this year be hosted in their home. "For your sake," he explained, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "You haven't been able to attend the last two. This way, you won't have to travel." Naomi smiled, keeping her expression neutral. "That's thoughtful." He glanced up at her then, something flickering behind his carefully curated concern. "It will also be an opportunity to make some announcements about the studio's future." Naomi's stomach twisted, but she kept her smile in place. "Sounds important." The preparations for the gala unfolded over the next several weeks. Naomi watched with quiet calculation as Edward orchestrated every detail: the guest list, the catering, the decorations. Kira was a constant presence, her name on every email, her voice in every conversation. It became clear, in bits and pieces, what Edward intended. He would use the gala not only to consolidate his control over the studio, but to introduce Kira publicly, to rewrite the narrative of their lives before an audience of investors, clients, and friends. Naomi's humiliation would be complete. What he couldn't know, was that she had been preparing her own stage. Martina adjusted their therapy sessions accordingly, focusing not just on strength, but on stamina. Naomi practiced standing for extended periods, walking short distances with a cane. The work was grueling, but she pushed herself harder with each session, fueled by a determination that burned brighter than any physical limitation. Clara and Raphael finalized the legal case, cross-referencing every document, every transaction, every manipulation. They coordinated quietly with law enforcement, ensuring that the evidence would not disappear when the time came to act. They also began preparing Naomi for the public fallout, how to control the narrative, how to speak about her experience without descending into the spectacle Edward expected. The night before the gala, they met one last time. "Are you ready?" Raphael asked. Naomi looked around the room, the files neatly arranged on the table, the documents and recordings that told the story of her dismantled life. She met his gaze evenly. Yes. That night, she lay awake long after Edward had fallen asleep beside her, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom that had become her prison. The walls felt different now, not confining but temporary, as though she could already see the cracks beginning to form. She thought back to the woman she had been before the accident, the architect who shaped skylines, who stood unapologetically in rooms designed to exclude her, who fought for every inch of her success. That woman had never disappeared. She had only been buried. Tomorrow, Naomi would reclaim her voice, her name, her future. And when the walls came down, she would be the one holding the blueprint. The night of the gala arrived cloaked in a false kind of serenity, the air heavy with the scent of spring rain and the soft rustle of evening winds brushing against the towering glass facade of Naomi's home. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. Warm lights spilled onto the freshly manicured lawn. The rhythmic hum of subdued music drifted into the night, and well-dressed guests moved like shadows across the marble entrance, their laughter bright and oblivious. Naomi had spent the day watching the preparations unfold like a well-rehearsed performance, noting every detail Edward had arranged, every calculated smile he wore as he welcomed their guests into what had once been her sanctuary. Inside, the house had been transformed. Florists had worked tirelessly to fill the vast living room and adjoining spaces with delicate white orchids and soft candlelight. The staff moved seamlessly, offering glasses of champagne and meticulously arranged hors d'oeuvres. Every corner of the house had been curated to project an image of prosperity, elegance, and control, the image Edward Sanders had cultivated so carefully over the years. Naomi had dressed deliberately. She wore a deep emerald gown, simple and elegant, one she had chosen herself without Edward's approval. It was a gown from a time before the accident, before the medications and the fog and the lies. Martina had helped her dress, her hands steady but her eyes shimmering with something close to pride, when Naomi insisted on wearing shoes instead of the house slippers Edward preferred she use. Naomi's hair was styled neatly, her makeup soft but purposeful. She looked like herself again, or rather, like the woman she had fought to become once more. She waited in the quiet of her study as the guests began to arrive, her heart beating steadily beneath her ribs, her cane resting at her side. The familiar weight of her wheelchair stood in the corner, unused for the first time in months. Every movement she made had been practiced, measured, calculated over the past few weeks. Tonight, she would stand not because Edward wanted her to, but because she chose to. Raphael had arrived early, mingling quietly among the guests, unnoticed by most but observant of everything. Clara remained nearby as well, posing as a family friend, a small earpiece tucked discreetly behind her hair, connected to the hidden cameras positioned throughout the house. Martina stood by Naomi's side now, her presence a quiet reassurance. The plan had been set in motion long before the first guest crossed the threshold. Naomi's team had spent weeks preparing for this moment, every piece of evidence cataloged and secured, every step of the evening choreographed with surgical precision. The police liaison was standing by. The press had been tipped off anonymously, and the district attorney's office had reviewed the materials Naomi's team had compiled. All they needed now was the final curtain to fall. At precisely 8:30, Edward took the stage. The small platform had been erected at the far end of the main room, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an expansive view of the city skyline. The guests gathered as he tapped his glass gently with a fork, the familiar sound drawing their attention like a conductor summoning his orchestra. Naomi remained at the periphery, watching from the shadows as he began to speak. "Friends, colleagues, distinguished guests," Edward's voice carried smoothly across the room, warm and commanding. "Thank you for joining us this evening. It means the world to me to welcome you all here in our home, a place that has witnessed both incredible joy and unimaginable challenges." The crowd murmured appreciatively, some glancing toward Naomi's empty wheelchair positioned near the front as Edward continued. "For the past few years, many of you have stood beside us during difficult times. My wife, Naomi, has shown remarkable resilience and grace in the face of adversity. Her strength has been an inspiration, not just to me, but to everyone who knows her." Naomi's jaw tightened slightly at the careful inflection in his voice, the subtle way he spoke about her as though she were absent, reduced to a symbol rather than a person. Edward smiled, raising his glass. "And tonight, I want to share with you not only the next chapter in our company's journey, but the next chapter in our lives." The lights dimmed slightly, and the projection screen behind him flickered to life, displaying sleek architectural renderings of a new project, the Horizon Development. Naomi had seen them before, months ago, when she still had access to the studio's internal documents. It was the project she had begun before the accident, now repackaged and rebranded without her name attached. As Edward spoke, Kira Davis emerged from the crowd, moving to stand beside him. She wore a shimmering silver dress, her posture poised, her hand resting gently on the curve of her pregnant belly. The audience gasped softly, the murmurs rippling like waves. "I'm pleased to introduce Kira Davis," Edward announced, his smile widening. "The new creative director of our firm, and," he paused for dramatic effect, "the mother of my child." The applause was polite, strained. Many guests glanced toward Naomi's wheelchair, confusion and discomfort etched across their faces. Naomi stepped forward then, her cane clicking softly against the marble floor. The sound drew the room's attention like a needle dragged across a vinyl record. The crowd parted instinctively as she moved toward the stage, her back straight, her gaze unflinching. Edward's smile faltered when he saw her, a flicker of something cold and calculating passing through his eyes. "Naomi," he began, his voice low, almost warning. She stopped at the foot of the stage, lifting her chin. "If you don't mind, Edward," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the silence, "I'd like to say a few words." The guests shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances, others watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. Edward hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, forcing a smile. "Of course," he said, stepping aside and handing her the microphone. Naomi took it without looking at him, her fingers steady as she turned to face the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice smooth and even. "This home has indeed witnessed great joy and profound pain, and tonight it witnesses something else. Truth." She paused, letting the word settle over the room. "For the past 3 years, I've lived a life carefully curated and controlled, not by circumstance, but by design." The projection screen behind her flickered again, this time displaying images of financial documents, email correspondences, medical records. I have spent these years under the care of a man who claimed to love me, Naomi continued. A man who, while presenting himself as my protector, systematically dismantled my autonomy, manipulated my treatment, and stole the company I built. The audience was silent now, the tension in the air palpable. Naomi's voice remained steady as she outlined the financial fraud, the manipulation of her medical care, the calculated efforts to isolate and disempower her. Every claim was supported by documents flashing behind her, bank statements, forged signatures, emails with damning instructions. She spoke of the construction accident, the falsified safety reports, the footage of Edward on-site hours before her fall. She spoke of the medications the doctors instructed to keep her dependent, the friends and family quietly pushed away. She spoke of Kira, not with malice, but with the cool precision of someone laying bare a truth too long hidden. And when she was finished, when every piece of evidence had been presented, Naomi took a deep breath and did something she hadn't done in over a year. She walked. With deliberate care, she handed the microphone to Raphael, who had stepped forward from the crowd and crossed the stage without her wheelchair, her cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. The silence broke then, not with applause but with stunned whispers, the weight of revelation settling over the room like a shroud. Raphael addressed the crowd briefly, explaining that law enforcement had been informed that formal charges were being filed. As he spoke, the doors opened and two plainclothes officers entered quietly, moving toward Edward. The moment passed in a blur, Edward's expression slipping from polite concern to icy rage as the officers approached, Kira shrinking away, the guests parting to let the authorities through. Naomi stood still, her breath steady, her hands loose at her sides. She had spent 3 years living in a prison Edward had constructed. Tonight, she had torn it down. The days following the gala unfolded like the slow dissipation of a storm, the air heavy with the weight of all that had been exposed. For Naomi Sanders, the night had not ended with applause or celebration, but with the quiet, necessary collapse of the structures that had once defined her life. She had stood in front of 200 witnesses and shattered the illusion Edward had so carefully crafted, tearing down the facade brick by brick until nothing remained but the raw, undeniable truth. In the hours after Edward's arrest, the house emptied in a stunned hush. Guests left quickly, their footsteps awkward on the marble floors, their voices low as they exchanged whispers of shock and speculation. The home that had once hosted dignitaries, architects, and philanthropists was now the scene of a reckoning that would reverberate far beyond its polished walls. Naomi had watched them leave without speaking, her body still tense from the weight of what she had done, her mind processing the reality of the aftermath. She had not yet allowed herself to feel relief or victory. There was still too much to be done. The police had spoken to her briefly that night, their questions professional, respectful. She provided them with copies of the evidence Raphael and Clara had compiled, documents, recordings, financial records. There would be more interviews, formal statements, court proceedings. She knew the process had only just begun. Raphael stayed long after the last guest had gone, sitting with Naomi in the quiet of her sunroom, the scent of extinguished candles still lingering in the air. He didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be done had been set in motion. Martina had stayed as well, hovering quietly at the edges of the room, her presence a steady anchor. She helped Naomi change out of the emerald gown, her movements careful and gentle. Neither of them spoke of the evening, of the spectacle that had unfolded. Instead, Martina's hand lingered briefly on Naomi's shoulder as she left, a silent acknowledgement of everything Naomi had fought to reclaim. Naomi spent the night alone, seated in her wheelchair by the large bay window overlooking the garden. The city lights shimmered in the distance, the night air cool against the glass. She did not sleep. She did not weep. She simply sat, letting the quiet wash over her. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, meetings, and statements. The district attorney's office moved swiftly, charging Edward with multiple counts of fraud, financial misconduct, and medical abuse. The evidence was overwhelming, the narrative inescapable. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, headlines flashing Naomi's name alongside Edward's in bold, uncompromising font. The coverage varied. Some praised her courage, others fixated on the scandal, the betrayal. Naomi read none of it. She did not need to be told what had happened to her. She had lived it. Kira Davis disappeared in the days following the gala. Clara informed Naomi that she had been cooperating with authorities in exchange for immunity, providing detailed accounts of Edward's manipulation and the financial schemes they had orchestrated together. Naomi felt no vindication in that knowledge, only a quiet sadness for the woman who had become a pawn in a much larger game. Her studio, too, reeled in the aftermath. Employees who had once distanced themselves returned cautiously, offering apologies, explanations. Naomi listened, but said little. The betrayal had not only been personal, it had extended to every corner of her professional life, infecting relationships and reputations. In the weeks that followed, Naomi met with the board of directors, dismantling the structure Edward had created piece by piece. She reclaimed her role, not as a figurehead, but as a leader. The company underwent a complete audit, every transaction examined, every policy rewritten. Naomi insisted on transparency, accountability, and change. The foundation she had once built to promote accessibility and inclusion had been gutted by Edward's greed. Now, she began the painstaking process of restoring it, ensuring that every stolen dollar was returned, every project completed. It was not an easy process. It was exhausting, often disheartening. But Naomi approached it the same way she had approached everything in her life, with quiet determination, with the knowledge that true rebuilding required more than a single act of defiance. Her home, too, changed in the weeks after Edward's arrest. The sterile modifications he had installed remained, but Naomi stripped away the coldness he had imposed. She reopened the sunroom to visitors, filled the space with warmth and light. Martina continued to visit, her sessions now focused less on necessity and more on strength, on reclaiming every inch of Naomi's independence. Her relationship with her family mended slowly, cautiously. Her sister, who had called repeatedly in the days after the gala, arrived one afternoon unannounced, standing awkwardly on the front steps until Naomi opened the door herself, leaning on her cane. The embrace they shared was long overdue. It took months before Naomi felt the weight of it all begin to lift. The betrayal, the manipulation, the years stolen from her. The scars remained, both visible and invisible, but they no longer defined her. When the trial finally began, Naomi attended every day. She sat quietly in the courtroom, listening as the prosecution laid out the case piece by piece. The financial fraud, the medical manipulation, the calculated effort to isolate and control her. Edward sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. He did not look at her. Naomi did not expect him to. She testified calmly, clearly, her voice unwavering as she recounted the years of subtle control, the medications, the lies. She spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been trapped behind the facade of care, for those who had been told they were imagining their own suffering. The verdict was inevitable. Edward was found guilty on multiple counts, sentenced to prison, his assets seized, his reputation in ruins. Naomi did not attend the sentencing. Instead, she spent the day at the Center for Inclusive Design, the project that had once been her dream, now fully realized and thriving under new leadership. She walked the halls slowly, her cane tapping softly against the polished floors, her gaze lingering on the walls lined with photographs of completed projects, testimonials from those whose lives had been changed by the work she had started. It was there, in the quiet of the atrium, that she finally allowed herself to breathe. Months later, when the media frenzy had faded and the dust had settled, Naomi agreed to one final interview. The journalist asked her about the trial, the betrayal, the years she had lost. Naomi answered each question carefully, deliberately. "It wasn't about revenge," she said finally, her gaze steady. "It was about reclaiming my life." The interview ended quietly, without fanfare. That night, Naomi returned home to the house she had spent so long resenting. It felt different now, not because the walls had changed, but because she had. She walked through each room slowly, her steps steady, her posture straight. When she reached the sunroom, she stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. She thought of everything she had lost, everything she had reclaimed. And for the first time in years, she felt free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Check out other stories on the channel and share this video with someone who might find it meaningful.